What is up, guys? Welcome back to another video, and today I'm going to be showing you guys how to implement mouse input and buttons in Pygame. And so over here I have a simple game loop, and when I run it, it will spawn a player, and you can move left and right as well as jump. And so to implement mouse input, you want to go to your sprites class, and you want to create a new class called cursor, or whatever you want to call it. And it's going to be a sprite class, so it's going to be pygame.sprite.sprite. And then when we go to initialize the class, we're going to initialize it with a we're going to initialize it with a self and a game. And then when we define a group, we're going to put it in a cursor group, so game.cursor. Right, and then when we go to initialize the sprite, so pygame.sprite.initialize, we're initialize self and self.groups. And then we're going to make a self.game variable to pass in a copy of the game. And then we're going to make the image, for time's sake, I'm just going to make the cursor a black square, so pygame.surface, and it's going to be 15 pixels by 15 pixels. And then we're going to fill it with black, so self.image.fill, and then type black. And the only reason I'm saying black is because I have in a different file some predefined constants, and over here is the color constants that I have. And so instead of having to write the RGB every single time, I can just create constant variables and just refer to those instead. And that's why I'm saying black here. And so self.image.fill black, and then we're going to create a self.rect variable, and that's going to be the image getting rect. Right? And now in our update, we're going to first we want to set the mouse to be invisible, since we want the mouse to be, in this case, a black square, right? We don't want to see the default mouse, right? And so what we can do is set invisible by doing pygame.mouse.set_visible to false, right? And then now we're going to create a self.pause variable to house to get the mouse's position. So pygame.mouse.get_pause. Alright, and then the last thing we want to do is we want to set the top left coordinate of that square to the mouse. So self.rect.top left equals self.pause. Alright, and now when we go to find an instance of this class, we want to first create a cursor group, so self.cursor, and it's going to be pygame.sprite.group. And then we also want to update that, so self.cursor.update, and then self.cursor .draw, and we're going to want to draw it to the screen, self.screen. Alright, and the last thing we want to do is we want to define an instance of the cursor class, so we're just going to say cursor self. Right, and with that being said, that is all we need. So when we run this code, we should see a black square. Cursor is not defined. Yep, it's S cursor. Right, and there we go. You see you have a black square wherever your mouse moves. Right, and so now it's simple as that. And so now to implement buttons, it's going to be pretty easy as well. So again, we're going to create a button class. So just, I guess, button 1. And again, it's going to be a sprite class. So it's pygame.sprite.sprite. And then when we initialize the class this time, though, we're going to pass in a self game and the x and y as well. Alright, and then we're going to create a self.groups variable. In this case, I'm just going to pass in game.altSprites, because that's the group class sprites group that I've defined earlier. And we're going to initialize the sprite. So pygame.sprite.sprite underscore initialize itself along with the groups, self.groups. Alright. And now we're gonna set self.game equals game, and self.image, again for time's sake, I'm just going to make this a surface, so pygame or a rectangle, so pygame.surface, and then this time I'm gonna make it 100 by 50. So 100 pixels wide and 50 pixels tall. And then we're gonna have a self.rect, or we're gonna want to fill this with a color. In this case, I'm just gonna fill it with white. And then we're gonna have a self.rect variable to be the self.image.get rect. And then we're gonna have the rectangle's x to be x times tile size. And the reason I'm multiplying by tile size is because I'm using a tile map. And if you're not using a tile map, then you don't need to multiply it by tile size. But I am, so I have to. So y times tile size. And there we go. And so in our update now, we are going to, it's pretty much the same as the cursor. So I'm going to create a self.pause variable to house the, or to get the mouse's position. So pygame.mouse.get underscore pause. Right, and now, since this is the button class, right, we can say something like if self.rect.collide point with self.pause. And so what this is, it's saying if the mouse collides with the rectangle, then we can say something, right? The easiest way, or the easiest thing we can do to indicate that something's happening is, I guess, changing the color of the rectangle. Right, so self.image.fill, now this time let's change it to like red. Right, so if the mouse hovers over that rectangle, then the rectangle will change to red. Right, and then you can say otherwise, you can have an else, then self.image.fill is going to go back to white. Right, so in this case, the else statement is here just to reset everything. So if you're hovering over it, it'll change to red, but if you're not hovering, or if the mouse is not colliding with the rectangle, then it'll remain white. Right, so now when we go to define this, I'm going to use my tile map, and this is not the point of the video, this tile map, so I'm not going to talk about this really, but let's just define a button class with a call in a row, and then this is my text, a tile map. And so I'm just going to spawn an instance of that class there. I'm going to save all. And when I run this, you can see there is a white rectangle. That's 100 pixels by 50. And so when I hover over it, you can see when my mouse collides with the rectangle, it changes to red. But if my mouse is not over the rectangle, it'll remain white because of that else statement, right? And so what if you want to detect, like, if you click the mouse? And so in that case, we can implement something like if your mouse is hovering over the rectangle, right, which is this, you can say if you click something, right, and so if pygame.mouse.get underscore pressed, we're going to pass 0 equals 1, and this 0 is indicating a left click. I think 1 is a right click and 2 is a, or sorry, 1 is a middle or a scroll wheel click, and then 2 is a right click, I believe. So if you're colliding, if your mouse is colliding with the button, it'll change colors. And then furthermore, if you left click, right, then you can say something like self.game.plane is false, right? And the reason I'm saying game is because we have a copy of the main class within here. So I can basically reference to things in the main class from the sprites class using self.game. And so self.game.playing is false, self.game.running is false, and that's it. Alright, so this is pretty much going to exit the game if we left click the button. So let me run it like before. Oops, has no attribute to get that because that's not spelled properly. See, get pressed. There we go. And so you can see here, you have the button, you have the mouse, and if the mouse collides with the rectangle, then it'll change colors. If it's not, it'll go back to white. But if your mouse is on the rectangle and you left click, it'll set the game to false, because that's what this line of code is. Right, and you don't have to just say, or you don't have to close the game. You can say like self.running to false, and then that'll pretty much reset the game. And so you can see if I run it now, I left click it, it'll just, I guess not, let's see. Self.game. Nope, self.game.playing is false, sorry. Self.game.playing is false. So we run it now, we left click, it'll restart the game, because when we start the game, the player spawns somewhere up here, and so when we left click, it'll respawn the player where it spawned. Right, and so that's pretty much the gist of it, right? And so to furthermore show you how you can implement buttons, I'm currently working on a game called Swift, and I'm going to quickly show you how I implemented buttons in this game. And so, oops, wrong thing. So this is the main, right? I just named it the name of my game, and if I run it, you can see here you have pretty much the same thing, right? You have a black cursor, and then you can see I have some buttons over here. I start, controls, and exit. And so you can see if I hover over the start button, it'll look like I'm pressing it. But if I move my mouse off of it, you can see it goes back. And if I hover over controls, same thing, and then exit, same thing. So I can do something like this, and you can see it will adjust accordingly. Right, so if I press exit, if I hover over exit, left click it, obviously it'll close the game. And if I press controls, it'll bring me to this page. And you can see here in this page, there's a back button. I left click back, it'll bring me back here, right? So the last thing I want to show you guys is how to implement, how to change screens. Like, how do I implement it to where it changes screens? And so in that case, what you can do is, you can see over here, when I run this, it'll run the title screen first, right? Because this is before the main game loop, which is down here, and so it'll run the title screen, which is what you saw earlier, and it'll run the title screen method, and this method is pretty much its own game loop, with the start button, controls button, and exit button all as a sprite, right? Right. And so when we run it, it'll run the title screen method, and it's basically its own game loop, right? Its game loop is right here, right? And then if I hover over the button, it's going to be pretty much the same thing, right? I just spawned those sprites. I created 3 button classes, right? The controls start and exit, right? And so you can see if I click the controls, you can see it's pretty much like what I showed you in the example, but instead I have this. And so what this is going to set it's going to exit the game loop, and pretty much like it'll move on from the method, right? Since self.waiting is false, it'll exit the game loop, right? And then after it exits the game loop, it'll then run, or it'll then go on to the control screen method, and that's again its own game loop, right? And that's what that control screen you saw earlier was, right? In this control screen, you can see I spawned in the back button, which allows you to go back to the title screen, right? The back button is pretty much the same as the controls button, but instead I'm going to set the control screen waiting variable to false, so it'll exit out the control screen method, and then it'll run the title screen method, which is again its own game loop, right? It's the first game loop, right? And so that's how I'm able to switch, right? You can see if I hover over it, I left click, it'll set the title screen to false, so it'll exit out the title screen method, and then it'll call the control screen method, which is here, right? If I press back, it'll set the control screen method to false, so it'll exit out of that, and then it'll call the title screen method back, so you're going to be back to where you started, right? And so those are some practical uses for buttons, and that's all I have for you guys. I hope you found this video useful, and I'll see you guys later.